With the multiverse having been engineered, it is time to talk about the inner workings of the multiverse. The multiverse formed within a larger realm known as the Megaverse, which in turn existed in the Omniverse. Because these larger entities contain all of existence, it would be impossible to talk about the goings-on in the Omniverse and Megaverse, and thus, we will only be focusing on the multiverse. There are multiple realities in the multiverse, and similar universes tend to be spatially closer to one another, creating things called universal clusters. Those scholars in the trans-tech community originally thought that the Primax Cluster was the oldest cluster. This idea changed with the discovery that the Simon Cluster was within the multiverse. Originally, trans-tech scholars believed that the Simon Cluster was completely separate from the multiverse, and instead resided solely in the Megaverse. However, further discoveries have found that the Simon Cluster is indeed within the multiverse, sitting right on the border of the multiverse and the Megaverse. This reveals the fact that Simon was indeed the first cluster, and is the natural ancestor of the remainder of the multiverse, serving as the transition from Megaverse into the multiverse. The Primax Cluster, originally thought to be the oldest cluster, composes roughly 50% of the known multiverse. Originally, it was thought that because Primax was the first cluster, more universes developed around it. In other words, it was as if Primax was the default universe, and later alterations between clusters was the result of a sort of mutation. However, this has been debunked with the discovery of Simon. Primax clusters typically involve a great war between Optimus Prime and Megatron. In the later parts of many Primax timelines, the Autobots and Decepticons are replaced by the Maximals and Predacons. Continuing in no particular order, we have the Union Cluster. As I continue this story, I'm sure many of you will point out that the events that we will describe here follow a different chain of events as written in the book called The Transformers: The Covenant of Primus. That is because the Union Cluster formed almost as if it were a bubble in a boiling pot, protruding out of the walls of the multiverse, yet still remaining inside of it. The quantum boundaries between the Union Cluster and the remainder of the multiverse were extremely strong, and consequently, what we will continue to talk about in this video, or this particular mini-series of videos depending on when you're watching this, will not necessarily apply to the events within the Union Cluster. The Union Cluster may be the farthest out cluster, excluding Simon. The Quad-Wall Cluster is the cluster of universes that are characterized by having pretty much a total lack of Transformers whatsoever, at least in the traditional sense. Transformers are present, but there are many of them in plastic, without any form of sentience or life. Odds are, the Quad-Wall Cluster consists of a cluster of universes that includes the universe you yourself currently reside in. It should be noted that the quantum boundary between the Quad-Wall Cluster and the rest of the multiverse is impossibly strong, even stronger than the border of that of the Union Cluster. There is no way to penetrate the barrier, and often only symbol communications can reach between the multiverse and the Quad-Wall Cluster. The RX Cluster is known for the use of minicons in the Autobot-Decepticon wars, as well as other items of great abilities like that of the Cyber Planet keys. The Fornax Cluster is known for its craftsmanship, and the modular pieces that the Transformers use there. It should be noted that the Transformers from the Fornax Cluster rarely go beyond their cluster. In the rare cases that they do, they usually lose the pieces that make them upon arriving in a new universe. If Simon is the farthest out cluster and Union is the second, then Zou Bitter is the third, being 37 quantum string vibrational levels from the Primax Cluster at the center of the multiverse. A confusing reality, Zou Bitter is not well understood by trans-techs. Zou Bitter universes feature an analog of Cybertron called Skalor, and a war between the heroic Protectons and evil Terracores rages on the planet. The fourth farthest cluster would be Guardant, being 17 quantum string vibrational levels away from the Malgus Cluster. The Guardant Cluster tends to have an unusually high level of chronoflux, making it difficult for outsiders looking at the Guardant timelines to be able to determine the proper order of events. The Guardant Cluster universes typically have pseudo-organic Transformers who do not identify as Transformers, and Cybertron is often called Gobotron. The Jocus Cluster is difficult, to say the least. Though these universes come together in a cluster, their similarities usually end at them being different from any other cluster. They include things like Transformers made from potatoes, or Transformers that often exchange pieces. Inhabitants from Jocus often face prejudice outside their home cluster, as many in the multiverse consider them to be a joke. Thankfully, interdimensional travel from the Jocus Cluster is rare. The Lucas Cluster has an overlap with the Omniverse, being related to universes that share features with the strange ability called the Force and Force-sensitive beings known as Jedi and Sith. What sets the Lucas Cluster apart from similar omniversal universes is the fact that large transforming mechs are used in their wars. The Nexus Cluster is a rare and small cluster consisting of universes that have had technological leaps and elongated periods of peace. The top 1% of Nexus universes are 2 to 4 million stellar cycles ahead of the rest of the multiverse, and the top 0.1% are 10 million stellar cycles ahead. Because of this technological advancement and peace, much of what we know from the multiverse today comes from the Trans-techs, the inhabitants of the most advanced Nexus universe. The Malgus Cluster is quite unique. The Transformer holding the title of Magnus serves as the supreme commander of the Autobots rather than that of a Prime. The entire cluster has a higher than normal interference wave range of 8.7, generated by the nonlinear y-at pulse function. In plain language, no multiversal singularities may enter this cluster. While this means that Primus and the Singular Unicron are not able to enter this cluster, Primus worship still has somehow emerged. The Malgus universes tend to run a century ahead of Tyran and Viron clusters. Despite not allowing multiversal singularities, the universe belonging to the story of Ben 10, based out of the Omniverse, may have managed to interact with the Malgus cluster, allowing the alien bounty hunter Kyber to collect Cybertronian artifacts. Many alien species from the Ben 10 universe may be found in the Malgus cluster as well. There is the Rovio cluster that includes transformers in the form of birds and pigs, there is the Yayers cluster of more simpler design transformers, and there is the Viron cluster, a relatively small cluster where the Decepticons at times are a subgroup of the Predacons rather than the other way around. And then there's the Tyran cluster. The Allspark cube has a large prominence here, and as a result, much of the early history of the Transformers starts here. The cluster holds a large prominence as it is the cluster where the 13 fell, but we'll get into this later. In between universes, inside the actual multiverse, is a sort of space generally called Transwarp Space. The other names for Transwarp Space include interdimensional space, unspace, overspace, underspace, infraspace, subspace, fold space, and the bleed. You may be familiar with the usage of Transwarp Space and the technology of advanced cultures, including many iterations of the Transformers. Many societies have managed to develop a way to bend the barriers between their universe and Transwarp Space to create an instantaneous teleportation travel system, or have managed to use technology to create pockets between dimensions, allowing for portable and secure storage, or to allow communication signals to be sent across galaxies. Other uses include creating a pocket to store mass if an individual changes their mass in the case of mass displacement. Despite this, many societies may be unaware that they are using transwarp technology at all. On the concept of transport with Transwarp Space, because of the odd laws of reality they follow, it is possible for more advanced cultures to utilize transwarp to travel through time. That being said, it is rare for societies to truly master the use of transwarp technology. Often, the technology is very unstable. A miscalculation, misstep, or mistake could see you lost in time, lost in space, or even somehow phased within the technology that it was used. The utilization of transwarp technology is also incredibly dangerous, because a wrong move could land one in Transwarp Space itself. Disregarding the fact that without a working transwarp device it would be unlikely to be able to return home, there is a race that has evolved and developed within the Transwarp Space as early as the time of the One. They are called the Elder Gods, and they are a monster all to themselves.